We're celebrating 50 years of D&D, so we're looking back at every edition of D&D, starting with a D&D first edition. What was it like? What are the differences compared to modern editions? And whether it's a classic or whether it sucked. My name is Jay, and I'm a professional game master, writer, and storyteller, playing TTRPGs across the country, on stage and on location with some of the biggest names in Tabletop. So let's get into exactly what is Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. First edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was released in 1977, ahead of the original Dungeons & Dragons game released in 1974, now fondly referred to as OD&D. And if I get enough comments wanting it, I will cover OD&D as well. AD&D was given the advanced title to separate it from the basic version of D&D, intended to be more newbie-friendly for complete beginners and younger players, although in reality most people started off with advanced D&D. Okay, so once you pick up a copy of any TTRPG, the first thing everyone wants to do is build a character. So what are the options here? Stats were very different compared to 5e, especially as the scores range between 3 and 18 for the usual strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. However, these scores determined a lot more in first edition, considering skills weren't even really a thing. Strength determined a modifier for the ability to hit a target with a weapon, damage, weight carried allowance, how likely you could force open a locked door, and even the percentage chance that you could bend bars or lift gates. Strength scores of 18 could also roll a D100 to determine exceptional strength, which can increase your abilities even further. Dexterity determines modifiers for surprise situations and missile-based attacks, as well as defensive adjustments for dexterity-based saving throws and dodging attacks. Constitution becomes a life or death situation. Constitution dictates a percentage for system shock survival for whether you die from aging, petrifying, or polymorph spells. Resurrection survival, and the character's initial con score tells us how many times the character can ever be resurrected. A con of 10 means your 11th death becomes final no matter what. Intelligence affects the number of languages you speak, the number of spells you can know, and even the percentage chance that you have to learn a new spell from a book or a scroll. Yes, you heard right, it was pass-fail. Wisdom is responsible for your magical attack modifier, what level of spells you have access to, as well as the number of bonus spells for clerics, and even the potential failure of spells cast by clerics if their wisdom is too low. Charisma refers to the maximum number of henchmen a character can have, the percentage modifier for their loyalty to you, and your reaction adjustment for social negotiation. So now that you have your stats, you want to apply them to your new character's race and class. But that's not so simple, so how does it work in first edition? We need to address race, class, and alignment together because they're so intrinsically tied together, and I'll show you why. In high contrast to 5th edition, there were not 1.5 billion races to choose from, there were 7. Humans, elves, half-elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, and half-orcs. All races except humans and gnomes come with stat bonuses and penalties. Why gnomes? Which bleeds into the classes. The classes are broken down into cleric, fighter, magic user, thief, that's right, not a rogue, and monk. Druids were actually a subclass of clerics, paladins and rangers were subclasses of fighters, and illusionist was a subclass of a magic user, and an assassin was a subclass of a thief. Each class has a minimum score for each stat that has to be met after your bonuses and penalties are applied. Just like classes, the races also have minimum and maximum values. So if you want to be a cleric, your wisdom must at least be a 9, but if you want to also be an orc, your wisdom can be no higher than 14. Pretty limiting, right? There were even minimum and maximum stats for male and female characters within each playable race, which meant that females could pretty much never be as strong as males. That was their opinion, not mine. Even further than that, some races and alignments are prohibited from being certain classes. For example, dwarves cannot be clerics, but you must have a neutral alignment to be a druid. There are also optional rules for psionics and bards in the appendices at the back of the book, but these had huge circumstantial requirements. For psionics, any magic user could possess psychic powers determined by a D100 roll and modifiers based on intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. But bards were ridiculous. I mean, bards are usually ridiculous, but for different reasons. To be a bard, you needed a minimum of 15 in strength, wisdom, dexterity, and charisma. You'll also need at least a 12 in intelligence and a 10 in constitution. Bards could only be humans or half-elves, and you needed to follow this pattern of leveling. Get ready. Starting with 5 levels of fighter, switching to the thief before 8th level. Once you have 5 levels in thief, you switch to a druid, but at the time you switch to a druid, you're actually a bard. Alrighty, so now that you have your character, you want to hit/hack and cause magical mayhem with them, right? Then roll for initiative. Initiative was way different in first edition. After any surprise rounds were resolved, the party would roll a d6 against the Dungeon Master's d6. The highest roll wins, and the whole party or the enemies go first. However, if one side is magically slowed, they would instantly lose, and if any single character was hasted, the entire party would automatically win initiative. Then, once that round was completed, initiative is rolled again for subsequent rounds. Rounds were then broken down into segments, which relied on casting and weapon segment numbers. So if I roll a 6 and you roll a 3 on initiative, your starting segment is equal to your opponent's initiative roll. So I would start on segment 3 and you would start on 6. I could therefore use any weapon or spell that causes 1 or 2 segments to go before you can act, because segment 3 as a start point, plus my attack segments totaling 4 or 5, is less than your starting segment of 6. Are you keeping up? In this example, if my speed factor is 3 or more, which is tied or more than your starting segment, then we have to compare segment totals from our actions to see whose attack actually strikes first. But when you've finally worked out when you're attacking, you still have to hit them and calculate that based on armor class. But how was it different? Armor class that would become known as THAC0, or to hit armor class 0, is a descending system. The lower the armor class, the harder it is to hit. This went as low as -10 and as high as 10, with 10 being no armor whatsoever, nor any dexterity bonuses. Rolling to hit was pretty much the same as modern editions. Roll your d20, add your bonuses, and that was your attack roll number. Now comes the fun part. Once you have your attack roll, you would then consult tables that showed the minimum number you needed to roll according to your character level and class to hit the enemy's armor class. Clearly, the wargaming influence came into play when designing all of the crunchy combat mechanics compared to the much simpler and accessible form that we see today. Overall, I see a lot of merits in AD&D First Edition. The combat plays out fairly realistically, with the use of segments to illustrate just how and when attacks actually strike. But for me at least, the logic of the THAC0 system is wild. However, the clear boxes that classes, races, and even sexes are put into can be extremely limiting to those who want to focus on unrestricted storytelling. But as always, all rules are optional, so play as you see fit. Or, if you want to see an example of how these more crunchy rules are alive today, you can check out Dungeon Crawl Classics in this video right here.